You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
So us at the Baobab Network, what we focus on is startups in Africa led by African that build the tech or tech-enabled solutions. So our mission, I'll say, is to make sure we back the best tech founders in Africa. I'm born in Cameroon. I'm a proud Cameroonian, but that doesn't mean I have to go back to Cameroon only to say I'm going back to the continent and help economic development and whatnot. I see a lot of friends or people I know, they want to come back, but they just say, yeah, but Art, it's half of what I'm making here. It doesn't make sense. The question you need to ask yourself is, do you understand the local context? Can you handle the operational challenge of working in Africa?
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Arthur Chupeau, who is head of ventures at the Baobab Network, which is an accelerator that backs early stage technology startups in Africa. Welcome to the podcast, Art. How are you?
Thank you, Tessa. I'm very well. Thank you for having me today as well. Very excited to share a bit more about what we do here.
Fantastic. Great to have you on the podcast. And I know you're busy and you've been traveling Africa extensively over the last couple of weeks, attending amazing events with regards to venture capital activities in Africa, which we will hopefully hear a bit more today.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure if you've listened to the podcast before, but I usually like to start from the beginning. So I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Arthur Chupeau.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a Cameroonian man, actually, right? So I was born in Cameroon, spent a few years in Cameroon, and then moved to France for my sort of teen years. I went to the US to chase my American dream. From there, I did many things, from working, from traveling, from doing DJing, working with fishermen in Peru. But the job that I guess was paying the job was investment banking for the most part. And then I think over the last 5 years, I sort of relocated back to the continent to do a bit more startup, venture capital, etc. But in a nutshell, it's very much a Cameroonian man at heart. Love Manchester United, not ashamed to say it, and love music, DJing, and essentially love everything connected or related to Africa.
Brilliant. So you've given us great insight into who you are and your journey into the world or the space of venture capital. As I said in the intro, you are the head of ventures at the Baobab Network. So I was hoping you can tell us a bit more about the network, what it is, and your overall mission in Africa.
So the Baobab Network is an accelerator, right? That basically back early stage startup in Africa. So what is an accelerator, right? If you look at the venture capital, and I'm sure I will talk a bit more about it later, it's basically an institution that provide capital to private companies around the globe, right? When it's for a company that is not yet well developed or well grown, etc., it's called venture capital. And when those companies are a bit more mature, it's typically called private equity. So Accelerator, it's sort of in the value chain within the VC world, VC or venture capital, right? So it's an organization that will try to go very early into those technology companies and provide a bit of capital, a bit of advisory to really unlock the potential so that they can get more funding and they can go into a better path in their business. So us at the Baobab Network, what we focus on is a startup in Africa led by African that build the tech or tech-enabled solutions, right? So our mission, I'll say, is to make sure we back the best tech founders in Africa. That's our mission, right? And by that, hopefully unlocking a potential for economic development across the board.
That sounds extremely exciting. You've lived and worked in many countries. I think I noted down UAE, Peru, Southeast Asia, and now you're back in Kenya. What was the reason for moving back to Africa, moving to Kenya?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good one, Tessa. I think essentially we all have different stages in our life, right? So for me, I think when I started my career, I actually wanted to move back to Africa already, but then I had a big student loan and I had to pay the student loan and other things. So it just made sense to sort of see the world and learn and, get to Singapore, get to New York, get to London, get out there and just learn, right?
Yes.
And in the back of my head, the game was like, I learn as much. Hopefully I can go back to the continent, learn again, and then maybe share what I've learned, right? And so it just happened after 6-7 years of sort of a very good career. I decided, okay, it's never too late. Let me just go. So I left my job in New York and then I moved to Africa. Initially, I actually moved to Cameroon by pure luck. But why Kenya afterwards? Well, I guess as an individual, I click a bit better with Anglophone countries. That's number one. But I think, generally speaking, Kenya is also a nation that appreciates a change, right? It's a country where you see things moving fairly fast, at least within the African context. But there's also good infrastructure from roads, from internet. You have a good you have a good tech and innovation industry as well, right? Coupled with good education, good university. So basically, it sort of has all the pillars that is needed for a good tech ecosystem to thrive. And so I felt like, I'm more African than Cameroonian, if you want. So for me, if I want to go back to the continent, let me go to where I can learn a lot and perhaps bring that learning from Uganda or Cameroon or elsewhere, right? I think that's the idea, right? If
Yes.
African can learn from other Africans, why not? So that's kind of why I decided to also move to Kenya. And it's beautiful, right? The people are beautiful. It's a very good place to be, especially if you come from overseas. If you've never been to Africa, it's an easy place to land, I would say.
I agree. Kenya is a very beautiful country, and as you said, it's easy to do business relatively in terms of if you've never done business in Africa, Kenya is usually quite a good starting point. So you wonderfully detailed your passion to learn and share what you've learned internationally gave you the impetus almost to move back to Africa. I know from experience and from people I've spoken to, moving back to Africa is sometimes a lot easier said than done. So what advice would you give to people who are considering moving back to Africa? What are some of the things that you've learned in terms of the do's and don'ts?
That's a great question, and I have a lot of people typically reaching out to me, right? So I'll first answer with a few comments, right? One is that it's not for everyone, actually.
Yes.
You were born in the continent and then you left when you were young, or maybe you spent 18 years here and then you went overseas to study. That doesn't mean that you can come back or you will fit well, right? It's really not for everyone, right? You need to be ready emotionally, even, I would say.
Yes,
emotionally,
I agree.
Mentally, and a few other things. So that's the first thing. And it's okay if it's not for everyone. It's absolutely fine. I think the second thing is that, as we all know here, right? Africa is not a continent. It is a continent. It's not a country. So what I mean is it really varies where you go. If someone wants to move back to the continent, well, it really differs if they land in DRC or they land in Kenya or they land in South Africa or they land in Egypt, right? Things are very different. So it's quite important to know exactly, to sort of research a bit more on the local context, right? So with that in mind, I'll say, the third comment I'll add is, I don't think people should just go back to their country of heritage, right?
Yes.
I'm born in Cameroon. I'm a proud Cameroonian, but that doesn't mean I have to go back to Cameroon only to say I'm going back to the continent and help economic development and whatnot, right? So I think people should go where they can add value, essentially, and perhaps where they can also see that value back to them, right? Whether it's emotionally, financially, etc. So the do's, I'll say research, talk to a lot of people, perhaps lower your expectations so that you can only see good things. From a pragmatic standpoint, I always tell people, maybe do an internship or a fellowship and spend 3 months wherever you want to go first, right? You don't need to decide to move right away. Maybe you do a 3 month, 6 month internship or fellowship or whatever contract job. And the idea is to really understand the local context, wake up at 8, be in that traffic, understand the challenge of internet,
Yes.
the challenge of coworkers, etc. Right? It's very important because typically repat, they go back to the continent. It's for vacation, 3 weeks, 1 week in the village. It's great, it's quiet. 1 week by the beach, it's beautiful. and 1 week in a city, but maybe you just go out and then you sleep and you don't see what's happening, right? So it's very important, I think, to just have a test, right? In the start of what we call it a pilot, right? Just go, try, test. If you like it, you come permanently. If you don't like it, then you've tried, and that's okay, right? So I say that's the biggest do, right? At the end of the day, just go there and do it. The biggest don't definitely is don't expect the same experience as when you come in vacation, right?
Yes.
People will come 2 weeks and they say it's beautiful. Well, if you live there, it's very different, right? The reality is different. So that's very important. Another thing I think for repats, right, is they shouldn't expect sort of the same salary. You could in some countries. As a matter of fact, in Kenya, in South Africa, and some place in the continent, there's high salaries. But typically speaking, one shouldn't expect the same level of salary. Maybe they'll get more, maybe they'll get the same, maybe less. But at the end of the day, you're typically always winning because of cost of living, right? So but those are the two key things, right? Because I see a lot of friends or people I know, they want to come back, but they just say, yeah, but Art, it's half of what I'm making here. Doesn't make sense. Well, it probably makes sense why it's half. And you just need to understand the context and see if in the long run it makes sense, right? So I think this is kind of how I would tell people, lower your expectation, research, talk to people that have done it, talk to people that have done it and it went well, talk to people that have done it and it didn't go well. And then at the end of the day, the best is for you to come 3 months, just learn and experience. That would be my advice.
Thank you for that, Art. You've mentioned some key things there in terms of moving back is not for everyone. The continent is diverse and things are different than when you, say, visit for holidays or short stays to when you actually decide to fully base yourself there and also research before you move and understanding the local context. Currently, you have a lot of young people from the diaspora who are considering moving back to Africa to access some of these new opportunities that are available. So from your perspective, what's your advice or message to them with regards to the opportunities and challenges, specifically in your area of work in terms of startup investment?
Yeah. First of all, I'll repeat what I just said previously, right? A lot of it is about doing a trial, be it an internship or a fellowship. So let's say you want to leave Paris, London, New York, or wherever, and then you want to work in a startup or you want to work in a VC space in Africa, try to get an internship, trying to get a fellowship, right? And then you can really see if it's for you or not, right? Because it's not just the work you do, it's also where you live. Both needs to work, right? Yes. It's not just you love the job. If one doesn't work, then it's not going to be okay. So I think that's very important. If you were to come back in Africa and be an operator, so working for a startup, the question you need to ask yourself is, do you understand the local context? Can you handle the operational challenge of working in Africa, right? And these are key questions, right? Because, someone that wants to do growth, for instance, for a fintech, in the US is very different than doing growth for a fintech in Tanzania, for instance.
Yes.
Right? There's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. So it's quite important to gauge yourself and say, can I actually do that? Do I understand what are the challenges, right? I'll say from an investment side, things are more or less similar, right? Because we're looking at valuation, we're looking at comparables. So the sort of the core metrics VC will look like are similar. But again, I think the context is very understand, right? Can someone come to Kenya and engage actually how good is an opportunity, right? Because people will have the mindset, the parameters of what they know, but maybe in Africa it's different. And maybe within Africa, within region is different. I could give an easy example, right? In East Africa, for instance, there might be a lot of blending organization, but in Central Africa, there aren't that many. Okay. So, someone understand that, then if you see an opportunity in Central Africa pertaining to lending, maybe there's a huge opportunity because there aren't that many. But if it's in East Africa, maybe the market is crowded, right? So this is just an example. Very basic, very simple. But the idea is, again, it comes back to context. It is the biggest thing, if I'm to tell you, right? It's like, can you understand the local context, right? Because it's not advertised the same way we know how life is or less in the US or in the UK or in France. In Africa, things are very, very different. And so if someone understands the context, they'll win. The best way to do it, just come for 3 months, 6 months, try it, fail, learn, iterate, and then you're good to go.
Fantastic, fantastic. So you've given us some very practical tips regarding the opportunities and the nuances of accessing those opportunities in Africa. What we're seeing is that the opportunities are being driven by, thankfully, the changing narrative and international strategies used to engage with the African continent. For example, there seems to be more focus on commercial flows and trade instead of the old model of aid development. From your perspective, what is the importance of that and what impact has it had so far with regards to the area that you work in?
I think the key impact or what's important is like it probably has a better economic outlook for African countries, right?
Yes.
If you see the commercial flows versus aid, you're probably looking at a better output in the future, right? And so I'm not an economist, right? But when I see all these countries that have aid, they still have aid right now, right? But some other countries, perhaps there's a bit more commercial partnership, and it looks like, at least at my little level, that things are working a bit better. So I think here is the narrative, right? The mindset, it's the mindset. Do you want to work hard and achieve and make something happen, or you just want to be helped, right? Yes. And again, I'm not saying aid is not important, obviously, right? But I think it's really important to understand the balance and also the impact. So I'll say in a job that I do in a venture capital and working very closely with entrepreneurs in Africa, they want to learn things. So Yes. They want the commercial money to come in, but they also want the expertise to come in and stay, right? Because ultimately they learn, they iterate, and then that learning goes to partners, the business partner, etc. So for me, I think commercial money comes with expectation. Those expectations are an exchange of know-how to ultimately get a win-win. Those expectation is a financial return. So, I'm putting money and I expect a return. So it's sort of some sort of engagement, which I think is good. And I think at the end of the day, if Africa is a frontier market, that's what you want, right? We want people to come here and invest. And I use the word invest because when you invest into something, typically is good, typically.
Yes, I agree.
So it's important. I think it's just for me, it's more of a mindset. Again, I'm not an economist, but when I see at the micro level, it's just like people wants to, they just want organization outside of the continent. If they come here, they come for the long run. They come to support. They come and they have an understanding of what are the challenges, what are the local contexts, and they come with an idea of how they can support that growth, right? And I think that's why we're doing pretty well at the Baobab Network at the moment.
Fantastic. So you mentioned there in the startup space, people are eager to learn and retain expertise, which increases capacity and capability of locals. So I guess with this new sense of learning, acquired expertise, businesses generating income, we have seen a new sense of optimism and a belief that Africa is the future. From your point of view, is Africa the future?
Well, typically I tell people Africa isn't the future. Africa is now, right?
I agree.
It is actually now. So I think there's nothing better to be a pioneer and support the change of narrative, right? I think that's the exciting bit. Of course, people can go back to Africa in 20 years, 30 years, and it's great and things would have changed. But it's so interesting to be part of that change of narrative, that change of mindset. It's the youngest continent in the world, right? People are tuned to change. They want to succeed. They want to grow. And so it is now. It's not the future. Personally, I like frontier market, not just from an opportunities point of view, but also because I think there's a chance to build things and perhaps build, fail, learn, iterate, and succeed finally, right? So typically I think about Africa somewhere, maybe China 40 years ago, 30 years ago,
yes.
Right? Some people decided to move to China, to Taiwan, and sort of build businesses, support, and now we know what it became, right? So I really see Africa as a place for people that wants good challenge, wants to build things for the long run, and wants to be part of a change of narrative, right? That's super important. So Africa is in the future. It is now.
Fantastic. So you touched on some key points such as the importance of the change of narrative, change of mindset. Africa is not the future. Africa is now. Do you think sometimes we can get carried away and become too optimistic and not be very pragmatic about some of the opportunities? From your point of view, what are the real pragmatic opportunities in the Africa venture capital space?
One can be optimistic and pragmatic, I think, if I understand it
Yes.
right. That's number one, right? So I think it's not mutually exclusive, but it's important to be pragmatic indeed. I think in terms of opportunities, well, you have the typical financial services, right? Very important, called fintech, typically in the space, and they typically are an enabler for many other things, right? And that's why we also see a lot of these startups typically raising a lot of money. There are huge opportunities as well in trade, in logistics, right? In healthcare to some extent. But generally speaking, I'll say any organization or startup that is building infrastructure to support SMEs in Africa will typically have a huge opportunity, assuming the execution is done properly, right? And because, the SMEs or the MSME, I should even add, are the bulk of the economy on the continent, right? So if you are building a solution that facilitates their life, there is a huge opportunity at the end. I'll say one last thing is across all the sectors, we've seen that there's a huge opportunity when it comes to embedded finance, right? And that is because most value chains are fragmented, right? So just to give an example, let's say a startup has a good commercial, has a good base of customer, right? In let's say, for instance, in healthcare, and the solution they're providing is it's just drugs to pharmacists, for instance, right? Facilitating the value chain. But there will be an opportunity, for instance, in the future to provide loans to those pharmacists, for instance, because those pharmacists, they are not able to get a loan from the bank, right? But now, with those kind of embedded finance opportunities, that pharmacists could get a credit from the same startup that was just providing drugs to them. And so that sort of embedded finance presents a huge opportunity across the board, because now it's not just, you could have a healthcare company, but then you also have a bit of a fintech. You could have an edtech education startup, but there's also a bit of a fintech there, right? So those are the huge opportunity. And that is why typically we see a lot of startup in fintech space raising a lot of money, or startup in various sectors, but they always have that lens of fintech, and they typically also raise money because the opportunity can be very huge.
Fantastic. So you've highlighted that there are opportunities in areas such as finance, trade, logistics, and companies building infrastructure or solutions to develop Africa will present huge opportunities. So with the work that you do, you have access to a lot of insights and realities about the true opportunities. So what does it mean or look like to work in the space in Africa with regards to pre-seed stage?
Sure. But just to reiterate on the point earlier, right? So I think the key thing is any startup really building infrastructure to support SMEs or MSMEs, right? That's very important, really, because we've realized like the B2C, business to consumer, is quite tricky sometimes, at least from a commercial standpoint for now. But B2B solutions typically tend to be favored by investor, but also because they actually are a real opportunity, right? So that's really important. Like if you build a solution that can really facilitate the life of SMEs and using tech or a tech enabling solution, that can be a winner. But back to your question, Tessa, I think, working in that space in Africa, especially at the pre-seed, means it's never boring.
I can imagine.
It's always exciting. There's always something new to learn, and if you do something continental, then you can see the differences between Northern Africa, Central Africa, West Africa. Within a region as well, you can see the difference. Kenya is very different than Uganda or Rwanda or even Tanzania, right? So things never get boring. I have to say, I think there was a bit of bubble in the past year, I think, especially when you look at valuation, but also from a startup mindset, right? Everybody wants to be a startup, right? Everybody wants to have a startup. And sometimes, I understand where they're coming from. If there are no opportunities, then, you just want to build something and then, and then you build it. But a lot of time, these startups, unfortunately, they don't really solve a key critical problem, which means essentially they won't probably go anywhere. And again, I'm using the probably because, I don't know, right? But typically that's what we've seen. And and what it meant basically with the recession that came recently is like we've seen a shift from what we call a founders market, right? Where there was a lot of founder and then the valuation were very high, to now more of a an investor market, right? Whereby now investors can sort of pick who they want to invest. But at the end of the day, if founders have a very good business, they will get funding. Absolutely. But last year, a lot of businesses may have gotten funding. They probably shouldn't have gotten as much, or maybe not at those valuations. But, I guess that's the game, right?
Yes, yes. You've given great overview of what it looks like to work in Africa at the pre-seed stage. There's always something new to learn. It's never boring. And also the ranges and differences in different African markets.
Yeah. Can I add to that, actually?
Yes, of course.
I think the key thing here as well is like working with African entrepreneurs, we learn a lot, right? Because they understand the context very well. So right now I'm presently in South Africa, and then we've talked to some founders. They were born and raised in township, and they want to build solution to solve a critical problem in township, right?
Awesome.
That's how we learn properly. Then we see a founder that really understand the market, understand their user, understand the context, and then, provide a solution. So our job is to really see if there is a huge opportunity, how tech or tech-enabled is that solution, and is there a commercial opportunity or not, right? So it's very interesting because then you start really learning a lot about Africa. You learn about the challenge in a specific country, in a specific region. And I think that's very exciting. If someone is an Afro optimist, right? It's very interesting because I just learn and learn.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So it's clear that there are a lot of opportunity in Africa's startup space, but it could be said that a lot of those opportunities are centered around the four major markets, whether it's Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Egypt. But what are some of the nuances of these four major markets versus other countries, in terms of the differences in the sector and consumer behavior?
Yeah, it's quite a frequent question, right? So just for context, those top four markets are Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, and Kenya, right? So these are typically the ones that receive the bulk of investment, but also this is where most of the prominent startup will probably come from. But there is a bit of a reason for that, right? I typically say to people, if you look at what are the good pillars of a good tech ecosystem, right? There's a few things. Well, I guess is the government with infrastructure, both like roads, sports, airplane, etc., but also on the education side, right? Providing STEM program, good university, good school, right? So that's sort of one pillar. Another pillar is sort of the investment aspect. Are there venture capital or private equity companies that can fuel growth for these companies? I think another pillar, a bit related, but like, are there enough accelerator or even incubators or programs that really support entrepreneurship in a way that they are building a scalable solution, right? And perhaps one that people tend to forget is like, how big is the market? Well, guess what? Nigeria, Egypt, and Kenya are huge, have huge population, right? So even if you only do a solution for these single market, there's still a huge opportunity, right? And the reality versus the other countries but some don't have that. Some don't have the mass, the population to make something commercially viable. Some don't have any VC, venture capital, nothing to, no investor, When it comes to infrastructure, it's the same. We started this podcast by saying how Kenya has a lot of good infrastructure, but you don't have to go too far from Kenya and realize like things are very different even in East Africa, right? So I think at the end of the day, it really makes sense why these four markets are getting a lot of the funding. But my job as head of venture or as running the accelerator is to make sure that we also look at other opportunities because they are out there. It might just need that we need to do more hands-on work, right? We need to dig a bit more. But there are opportunities out there. And those opportunities, even if they are in a smaller countries, if we can see that they can go into another market very easily, we will be interested, right? And that is why right now at the Baobab Network, we have about 35 companies, I believe, in our portfolio, spread across 13 geographies. Obviously, the top four, but also secondary market like Ethiopia, like Ghana, like Morocco, Senegal, etc., right? So yes, there's always going to be difference with those top market, but if someone is intentional, they can find opportunities elsewhere. And that's our mandate as a Baobab Network. So for us, we're even more excited to do it because that's what we're supposed to do.
You've given clarification why Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa are the largest markets for startup investment in Africa, and also the pillars that make startups in those markets investable. You also touched on the work that the Baobab Network does in those markets and other markets. So if we look at the work that you do via Baobab Network, it does require a strong network and local partners. How have you gone about building your network and leveraging local knowledge to be successful in the market?
Yeah, I think the key thing is, I think I mentioned it earlier, is being intentional who you want to partner with, right? And so for us, even when we started, we were very cautious. We didn't want to come and being like, we know everything. So, the first thing we wanted to do is to talk to incubator on the ground, other accelerator that perhaps don't provide funding. We were also keen to talk to, I call them ecosystem enabler, right? It could be an incubator in a university. It could be a repat that came back and just build a studio where startups are. So at the end of the day, it was let's be intentional and trying to connect with the people that we share the same mission, right? And people recognize when someone is intentional or when someone just come from business or just someone come from for the gram and being on the news, right? People recognize that, right? And so I think we did a good job there to build that trust. And it's especially now with funders, right? Because we have a lot of application. But I think the other thing is, and one has to be humble and understand that, you know what you know and you don't know what you don't know, right? And Africa is moving fast. There's a lot of things changing every day. And so it's very important to come with humility and work with your partner, but also with your gut feeling to sort of understand, okay, does it make sense to do it? Does it make sense to do that? And what that means is sometimes you'll make mistakes, right? And that's okay. That's okay to make mistakes, as long as you recognize they are mistaken and you can iterate and change, right? So and what I'm saying is exactly what we tell startup as well, right? Because the market, everything is nascent. We need to be cautious about our approach when we want to work with people. The same way founders, when they build a new solution, they need to be cautious because, it might work for 10 people, but actually when you look at 100 people, it doesn't work anymore.
You touched on some key points there in terms of being intentional, connecting with the right stakeholders, building trust, and also be humble. So I guess with that, building a strong local network, it is critical to generating a strong pipeline of investable startups in Africa. So can you tell us how you leverage your network to build your pipeline of startups?
Yeah, if you go back to the basics,
yes.
If you look at supply versus demand, well, in Africa, there's very few organizations that actually invest into startup at such an early stage and led by Africans. Because of that imbalance, we are bound to always have a strong pipeline coming to us, right? I can probably count in one hand the number of companies that will go take that risk and invest very early. And yet, we're talking about 54 countries, 1,000 of cultures, many, many solutions out there, right? So the supply versus demand works in our favor at the moment. And that was the plan, right? Why would we do something that everyone does? That doesn't make sense. So that's the number one. I think the number two, like I said earlier, is to work with incubators and accelerators. So the Baobab Network for us, we are mostly based in Nairobi, Kenya, right? But we invest across the continent and we back funders across the continent, which means sometimes as much as we have local context and knowledge, it's quite important for us to connect with those incubators on the ground or those accelerators on the ground, right? Because they might know something we don't know, and they basically build pipeline for us. And then us, we build pipeline for angel investor, and then angel investor goes to early stage VC, right? So if everyone does their job well, then it actually works. The third thing we do is to travel, right? As I said, I'm typically based in Nairobi, Kenya, but presently in Cape Town, South Africa. But we travel to understand the local and regional context, but also to meet startups and other partners such as the VC, the accelerator, the incubator, angel investor, right? So we are still in Africa and it's still nice to shake a hand at the end of the day, right? So it's quite important to travel and to allocate budget for that. And it was a bit of a challenge, obviously, with the pandemic the last few years, but now I think things are getting more and more normal, back to normal. Two more things we do. is running physical events. So when we travel or whenever we are in Nairobi or anywhere, it's quite important to run events where founders can meet up, right? Being a founder is it's quite a lonely journey. Huh?
It
One has
is.
to be a very strong introvert because you're quite alone, and then you do things nobody understand why you do them, but yet you do them. Especially if even at the gender lens here, especially in Africa, where some female founder I've talked to will be like, people have told me, Art, why don't you just find a husband sometimes? So it's quite important to have founders meeting up so that they can share their learnings, their wins, but also the negative one, and it really help the community. So for us, it's called a network also because we want to make sure people can really help each other on everything, not just the good one, right? So that's quite important. And of course, as a tech investor, we have to be online, right? So for us, we run a newsletter, we have a good social media presence, and then we understand that we need to balance the offline and the online, right? The online is a bit more broad, it's a bit more generalist, and it's easy to find. But the offline is like, okay, we are in your country right now. We want to meet you. We want to talk to you. Tell us what we don't know, right? And it's a good balance. And that's how we learn. That's how, as an accelerator, we're able to really understand what are the challenges in Southern Africa versus Egypt or versus Kenya, right? And that is because we have to invest in that, right? We have to invest into our network of our local partners, into traveling, but also into running newsletter and social media, which means we need to do a bit of research and find information that can be shareable and important for funders.
You detailed how there are few people that invest in African startups at an early stage and the dynamics between supply and demand, also your activities, traveling, holding physical events to network and meet new founders. So if you look at, say, your fund investment preference, in terms of your past and current investments, what sectors are you kind of swaying towards more in terms of what sectors of interest are you focusing on?
Yeah, actually, I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but the Baobab Network, we are sector agnostic, which means we can invest in any sector as long as the solution is tech or tech enabled. I think what it requires is African funders in Africa. So that's a requirement. We appreciate that a lot of organizations can be led by non-African, and that's fantastic. But for us, our mandate and our mission is to make sure we can back those African funders. So that's very important for us. As I say, sector agnostic, we need to see a huge market opportunity, right? If a startup is building a solution just for 10 million people, or potentially 10 million people, it's not the same as building something for like 100, 200, 300 million people, right? So the huge market opportunity is quite important. And essentially it's quite important is because when you look at the revenue model of the VC or venture capital, right, they need to bank on that huge market that a startup can obtain in the future. So I'll say these are kind of the sector we look at. Now, although we sector agnostic, if we look at our portfolio, we do have a bit of fintechs, we have a bit of healthcare solutions, a bit of education as well. But then we also have things like advertisement. We also have things like marketing tech or things like construction tech. So, as we know, there are many opportunities. I don't want to use the word problem. There are many opportunities in Africa, and based on founders' background and then understanding of the market and in their experience, they come up with great solutions. And, we typically think that they could be a good one, and then we back them.
Thank you. You mentioned there that you're sector agnostic and you like to back African founders. So I was hoping that we could look at that in more detail with regards to what you look for in startups when deciding to invest in them.
Yeah, so we're trying to be transparent with that. So actually on our website, we have FAQs that sort of touch on those things. But I'll say there's perhaps three key things, right? Number one, and perhaps the most important, is the founder, the founding team and their experience, right? That's the most important because at the stage we go in, we need to see founders that really understand their market. We need to see funders that are very good at executing, right?
Yes.
Operating in New York is very different than operating in Lagos or Accra. It's just very different. So we need to have that grit, that resilience. We need to see those attributes into a founder, right? So, if I were to do percentages, I'll say 50% is a lot into that, right?
Okay.
the market opportunity of the solution they're building is very important. We love to see that it's like $1 billion plus typically, and that's kind of where we get excited. And that's important because the way the model is financially for us, we need to make sure the tech solution can reach to many, many people and as fast as possible, right? So the market opportunity is very important because it ties into the solution getting into many people. And I'll say maybe 30%. And then the last 20%, it's around the traction, the velocity, the growth, right? How they're growing, like how are they doing the last 6 months, 9 months, right? Are they growing 20% month on month, 30% month on month, or is barely 5% month on month, or it's flat, right? Are they adding a lot of new users? Do they have a lot of attrition and churn? So those are the sort of things we look at. But essentially, it's very much we know that the founders, they're African, for us to really initiate the conversation. Then how good are they, right? Do they really understand the market? Then, what's the market opportunity for such a business and how are they doing actually? If it's a huge market opportunity, but actually they don't have much traction, perhaps it means it's not the right executing team, or maybe it's too early for us. We need to wait a bit and maybe recontact them in a few months, right? But I'll say those are the three core things we decide now. But then obviously there's always a lot more. If you look at the fintech, you want to make sure the regulatory aspect is clean. And the same with the health tech, for instance, right? If you look at trade and logistics, you want to make sure that there's enough good infrastructure to actually enable what they want to do. So there's always going to be some more specific sort of items we look at depending on the sectors. But generally speaking, you want to look at the team, the market opportunity, and then the actual traction.
Some very interesting insights you've detailed that you look at founders and funding team, market opportunity of the solution, and also the traction and growth. From your perspective, given advice, what advice would you give to African startups, founders who are potentially considering or looking to fundraise?
Yeah, I talk to them every day. Right?
So this is what you do every day. So
yeah. I hope I do that well, though. But I think it takes time, right? That's the first thing. It takes time. And it means you need to prep yourself, right? You need to start as early as you can. No one wants to invest into someone that looks desperate, right?
Yes.
If you are very healthy, that's probably when you want to start fundraising because you have good momentum, you have good numbers, etc. If you look at your runway, which is the amount of money left for you to operate without potential any income, then you want to make sure you start your fundraising journey maybe 6 to 9 months before you run out of money, right? Because those conversations take a lot of time. The other thing is fundraising is sort of an art and not a science, or a bit of both. I think on the art part, it means that you need to be good at relationship management. You need to understand that there's a way to speak to people, there's a way to connect with people. Some people are just good at talking to people and some are not, right? Yes. Which means maybe you're the CEO, but if you are not the best person with communication skills, perhaps you should definitely learn how to pitch, but maybe you shouldn't be the most prominent person pitching out there. I think the science part is more around, there's always a process, right? There's a process how to reach out to someone on LinkedIn, right? Yes. There's a process how to reach out to even a cold email or ideally an introduction from another funders, right? All these things, there is a process, right? Like a quick example, if you're on LinkedIn and then you add someone, you add a VC, an investor online. If you just add, hi, John, how are you, as a note for introduction for them to accept your request, they're very likely going to ignore your request.
Yes.
But perhaps if you go, hi, John, my name is Art. I run Startup XYZ. We are building the next XYZ tech and with a month-to-month growth of 20%. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Would you be interested? Or something a bit more punchy. Then someone right away see what they are. Because remember, VC investor, angel investor, they see those messages every day. Every day. So the science part with the art part here is like, as you reach out to those people, make sure to capture what really matters in that note, right? And for that, there's so many information out there. At the Baobab Network, we have a founder center where we write a lot of articles, but also online with other Accelerator, Incubator. There's a lot of content out there that are made for founders to make sure they have an easier journey when it comes to fundraising. But it's not easy. It really isn't easy. I mean, you have to think about what it means, right? You're asking someone to give them money for a business that hasn't been proven yet.
Yes.
But, the people that provide the money, they are well aware of the risk, right? It's called capital at risk. So they know it. And so now the job of the founders is to make sure you tell a story that relates. You tell a story that makes it like, yes, you are the right team to actually solve that problem, right? So those are the few things I'll say. But of course, you need to be ready with a deck. You need to be ready with a data room. You need to be ready with the financials. You need to be ready with a few things because once there is more due diligence, you want to make sure you don't lag, right? You want to make sure everything is ready. I'll stop there because otherwise it becomes my job and I can go on and go on.
No. Fantastic. You've given great advice in terms of founders looking to fundraise. But I wanted to look at it from a current kind of perspective as we are entering a challenging time. So what are the challenges that you're experiencing now that we are in the midst of? I guess you can describe it as a global economic downturn.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of challenge, but I think one of them obviously is like we see like global investor, they're a bit more reticent now to invest in Africa, right?
Okay.
But generally speaking, there's no major change, I would say, in Africa. Again, because it's a frontier market, the people that invest in Africa, they understand there's a bit more higher risk. There's a lot of things to disrupt. But because most of the funding comes from outside of Africa, you certainly may see a bit more reservation for investor to come in. And it depends on the stage, right? Maybe pre-seed, seed stage, you don't see that as much, but maybe you see it more around Series A, Series B, because you're asking much larger tickets, right? We're talking about potentially asking the global community of investor around between, say, 5 to 20 to 30 to 40 million, right? So for the pre-seed, we don't see much change, right? And then for the seed, but when you go to much higher ticket, it's a bit different, definitely. And that is why I said though earlier, but good business will still get the funding, right? But it just now people are a bit more worried. I mean, some of these people, they've lost a lot of money, whether in cryptos, whether in the stock market. So, they probably want to make sure they go back to basic, invest where they know, and then really keep a bit of money for when they really see a huge opportunity elsewhere, like in Africa. So I think that's the one challenge I'll see with the global economic downturn. But again, like we say in the industry, a lot of the VC have a lot of dry powder because they were able to raise money with the success of the last few years, right? But now they're just a bit more cautious where to invest that money, especially at the pre-seed, seed stage, and pre-series A. Later stage, definitely a bit more challenging.
Fantastic. So you mentioned there are no major changes with regards to investing at pre-seed stage in Africa. So we are seeing similar trends in that area. So if we stick to the theme of trends, what current trends in Africa's venture capital space are you currently excited about?
Well, that's actually quite a tough one, if you ask me. Well, I think we see more and more local funding.
Brilliant.
Especially from African angels, or business angels. So
you're seeing more former founders becoming funders?
We see that, right? Most successful founders, they also back the next generation, but we also see some high net worth or some executive writing $5,000, $10,000 tickets.
Okay.
And these people are African. So we see that more and more. Perhaps I'll say, especially in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, and of course in Egypt. But that's a good trend, right? Because it means that there's a local expertise, local money going into startups. And that's good because these people typically will understand the context that startup is operating in. And so it's a good thesis for them to raise a bit of money, and those startups can go outside of Africa to look for much larger tickets. But when you go outside, and someone sees that actually, you already have 20 or 30% of your round backed by local people, let me use that word, then it's actually good for them. So that's one, I think, exciting trend I see in the space. I think, again, I'm focusing on the pre-seed stage here, right? I think things are a bit different if you look at later stage, Series A, Series B. But although I could talk about it, I don't want to touch on too much and stay on the positive or on the pre-seed stage, yes.
Yes, we like to end on a positive. So you mentioned you're excited about local investors supporting African startups, and hopefully that's something that we'll see carrying on long term into the future. So if we look at the future of Africa, where do you see Africa in 5 years' time from a pre-seed investment perspective?
Well, yeah. I guess that one can be a bit more large, right? In 5 years, a pre-seed ticket could be a bit different, right? Serie A in Africa could very well be a pre-seed round or a seed round in the US, right?
Yes.
So I think in 5 years, I think the number of investment will increase, obviously. So that's number one. It means a typical pre-seed check, if let's say now it's between 200K to 500K, maybe it's much higher in 5 years' time, right? There's much more understanding. Yeah, I think much more understanding and people can really gauge a bit better. Something else I'm seeing maybe in 5 years or more is maybe more institutional investor from Africa. So earlier I mentioned they were very much business angels, so individual, right? But right now, most of the fundings from VC come from outside of the continent. So perhaps in 5 years, there would be some institutional investor really backing those VC to then invest into Africa. So that's something I'd like to definitely see in 5 years. Another trend perhaps is I think a huge opportunity with Francophone Africa.
Yes, I
agree.
agree.
I think countries like Senegal, Morocco, Cote d'Ivoire will be catching up because, again, if I go back to those different pillars, they sort of exist in those countries. I think for those, they need to make sure they speak English, right?
Yes.
So that they really become global and they can chase the money everywhere. But I think huge opportunity for these countries to be in a map. And maybe a third one would be around, I reckon we'll see some major exits or merger and acquisition, right? And basically highlighting the fact that there are commercial opportunities in Africa. I mean, in the past few years, we've seen some acquisition. We've seen the only one I have in my mind right now is Stripe acquiring Paystack. But there's been a few of this sort of exit for startup or M&A deals. And I think we are bound to see more in the next 5 years. Obviously, I'm very optimistic here, right? But I'm also quite pragmatic. There will be a lot of failures, and that's okay. But there will be deals that go through. There will be good success and good success stories, definitely.
I love it. You have given an extremely pragmatic and positive vision of VC investment in the startup space in Africa. So if we look closer at home, where do you see yourself and the Baobab Network in 5 years' time?
I wish I knew, actually. No, I think the Baobab Network in 5 years, I think we'll continue to be the leading accelerator, right? Backing African founders early in their journey. And that is just because of the people we hired, the mission we have at heart, the mandate we stick to, and I think the intention. We are very intentional in our team. And I think in the next 5 years, I don't see why we shouldn't be still leading the boat, really, right? So, and it's not really about boating, to be honest. It's like understanding, like it's a nascent market. And if you have the right team that have the right approach, then success can come. So I think that's something. I think also the Baobab Network in the next 5 years, we are bound to perhaps provide more service to founders, right? So right now we mostly do the 50,000 check for equity, which is for the accelerator, together with the 12 weeks accelerator program. But in the future, there's a huge opportunity for us to offer different type of funding for founders, from equity, from venture debt, and other schemes available, right? So what that means is like now founders that can come to us, not just for the accelerator, but perhaps for other things. So that's quite exciting, I think. I like to think in the next 5 years, we are at least in perhaps 50% of the countries in Africa, right?
Oh, awesome.
Because we understand that actually, if we back the right person, maybe in Mozambique or in Angola, there is a huge opportunity for them to do it in Angola, in Cape Verde, in Guinea Equatorial, and maybe in Mozambique, in all these Lusophone countries, right? So I think we really want to make sure and actually, even if it doesn't work, we want to be the first to go and understand that market, right? And so I think we should be there. For me personally, well, I think, perhaps I'll still be with the Baobab Network, or very likely also building my own startup and hopefully this time succeeding. But yeah, that's sort of the plan. I think it's always tricky because you're on the investor side, but we're also on the startup side as we talk to them every day. But I think for me, on the long run, I'm probably going to move back to sort of being an entrepreneur. I like to build stuff. I like challenge, and I can operate with ambiguity. I can operate, in context like emerging market, etc. So I might as well just use that skill and then trying to do something in the tech space or not. Not everything is about tech, right? That's still, I think, quite important for people, especially those that want to come back to Africa, right?
Yes.
Not everything is about tech, right? You can just come back and do something very amazing, very exciting, and it's not necessarily tech. And that works very well as well, right? So long that it provides economic development.
I agree 100%. As we've said throughout the conversation, the opportunities are endless. Tech is providing many opportunities, but as you mentioned there's opportunities in other areas within different African markets. So yeah, thank you for sharing that information with us. I'm excited to see what you do personally in the next 5 years and also the direction the Baobab Network heads towards in the next 5 years. Very exciting.
Yeah. We'll make sure I'll let you know.
Definitely. It'll be amazing to have you back on the podcast in a few years' time just to see how things have progressed, what's changed, what hasn't changed. So yeah, brilliant.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or even affirmations that keep us going when times are hard or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
I'm afraid I'm a bit boring on that one, but I guess one thing I always tell people is I think everybody has dreams, right?
Yes.
But just a few of us start the journey in making them happen, right? Or making them real. And there's absolutely no reason why people shouldn't start, right? So for me, you're dreaming about something, just start, right? I'm a hands-on person. I believe you don't need to do all the strategy. You don't need to do all the research. Sometimes you just start and then you realize actually, you don't even know what's going to happen, right? If you look at the best startups or some of the startups, they typically start by solving a problem and then they end up being something else they solve and then they become a huge success, right? So have dreams, but start making them happen, right? And then you're probably going to fail in the journey, and that's okay. You fail, you learn, and you iterate, and then you try again, right? So that's sort of these kind of things resonate with me because I have a founder mindset, right? But of course, if it doesn't resonate with you, perhaps it means you are not made for the startup world, right? And that's okay, right? I'll stop by with that. I don't know if that's exactly what you wanted.
No, that's brilliant. It actually reminds me of a quote. I think it goes something like, you don't have to be great to get started, but you have to get started to be great. Something along those lines.
I'll pick that one. I'll pick that one moving forward now. And it's true. I mean, especially for us African and us Black people, because we're always going to dream and we're always going to find reason not to start, right?
Yes.
And it's fine, right? But I think we need to find that inner strength that tells us oh, know what? Let me just go for it, right? For me, it wasn't really a big deal to leave New York and move to Africa. It wasn't really a big deal. But I can understand for some people it would be. And that's okay. You just do it. The worst thing that can happen, you just go back on a plane where you were, right? So, yeah, it's exactly the quote you said. It summarizes it very well, right? Just start, and then you'll see what happens.
100%. As we're coming to the end of the conversation, I was wondering if you had any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you do at the Baobab Network, or just people who are interested in startup investments, whether it's pre-seed stage or at different stages.
Sure. No, thanks for that. Definitely. So you can check our website, right? The baobabnetwork.com. We have a lot of information, be it for founders that are looking for funding, but also for angel investor or investor that are looking for pipeline. So definitely make sure to reach out. Also, more than happy to for you guys to reach out to me on LinkedIn on either the VC space, the startup space, or everything around Africa, right? But I think for my last comment would be targeted to anyone that really wants to either move back or move to the continent. If you have the right mindset, if you are ready to learn and observe, you are born to succeed, right? Because everything is new. If that's what you want to do it. The earlier, the better. Because Africa isn't the future. It is now. I know you would have said it as well.
Awesome. Fantastic way, or a perfect way to end today's conversation. First class insights from a first class guest. I've enjoyed our conversation today, Art. Loving the great work that you and the Baobab Network are doing in Africa. Extremely valuable and something that's timely and much needed on the continent. So thank you again. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for sharing your insights, your knowledge, your expertise.
Thank you very much, Jose. Anyone that wants to talk about the motherland, I'm always happy. And thank you for providing and pushing that podcast out there. It's very important things as well. So thank you. And thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I look forward to speaking again soon.
Awesome. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.